So, dear colleagues, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be again in Dubrovnik at Inter-University Center, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this excellent event. So thank you very much, Susanna, and thank you very Igor for this kind invitation. So today our focus will be maritime autonomous surface ships and International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification and Watchkeeping for Seafarers, or STCW convention. So in this presentation, we will emphasize some problems regarding seafarers when it comes to new type of the vessel, new generation of the vessel. So in the future, maybe this kind of pictures which we have now with the crew on bridge on board, maybe it will be not common in the future. So I have to put small sign on that one, because we have a new regulatory approach to autonomous vessels. So when we were preparing this presentation, I have to say that we remembered some key moments from recent history. So when the education of seafarers and their work on board had to be harmonized with the new technologies. So I'm sure that you all remember the termination of the job of telegraph operators with the introduction of global maritime distress and safety system. I'm talking about GMDSS. So today, for example, seafarers for training to work on the GMDSS, of course, they receive the certificate, and the same is provided, of course, in the provisions of STCW convention. So this is just one small example from not so far history, from recent history, of how the education of seafarers and how they work on board has to be harmonized with the new technology. In recent years, however, somewhere starting from 2015 and even earlier, we are more than ever at a turning point, as you know, in terms of adopting new technologies. Of course, I mean maritime autonomous surface ships. So in this context of use of maritime autonomous surface ships, a significant challenge is actually is the application of international conventions of standards of training and certification and watchkeeping for seafarers, which was, of course, adopted by IMO. So what we know about STCW convention, this convention sets out minimum requirements for education, for certification, for training and watchkeeping for seafarers that must be met by the member states. Also, among other things, this convention contains provisions on professional competencies in shipping. So every institution that organizes formal education must include in these minimum standards set by this convention in its study programs. For example, just as example, in Croatia, for example, we have 4 such institutions for formal education of seafarers, 2 departments, 2 faculties of maritime studies. So they all have to include minimum standards for STCW convention. Also, in addition to formal education, this convention contains also provisions on training programs that fall under non-mandatory education and are related to achievement of professional competences. Therefore, in terms of education of seafarers, formal or non-formal, and also in terms of certification of seafarers, there is a need to develop new competencies of seafarers or upgrade existing ones in terms of trained seafarers for the use of this new generation of ships. So the biggest changes associated with this new type of the vessels is to educate seafarers how to navigate, how to work with the cargo, how to control engine. Also, one of the fundamental questions is how to regulate the operations of the coastal control centers, as well as to define the status of human resources and to answer the question or whether they could also be considered as a crew member of the ship. So it is also important to find role and definition and responsibility of masters as well as remote operator. So these two questions will be really interesting to analyze. So our aim actually is to in this presentation is to identify the essential competencies needed to upgrade the provisions of this convention in accordance, of course, with the development of MAS. And also our purpose is to highlight problems in relations to seafarers when it comes to, of course, STCW convention and, of course, maritime autonomous surface ships. So we have to follow the sessions and decisions of IMO, first of all, of Maritime Safety Committee, as well as join working group on maritime autonomous surface ships sessions, which include and Maritime Safety Committee and Legal Committee and Facilitation Committee. And we will see, of course, current situation and a little bit of background of this relation between STCW and MAS. So I have to mention also and the definition and classification of MAS because it's really basic and it is basic point. And in this presentation, I also have to analyze some provisions from current STCW convention. So for us in institutions, in education institutions, it is really important this key point. So to sort out what knowledge and what skills need to be effectively improved by the seafarers. So every institution that educates seafarers, for us, it is really important to follow STCW and to put its provision in our study program. So we already need to prepare for these new challenges of education. And I have to say that some universities, some colleges, faculties as well, they already did they put some new courses, some new study programs in their education institution. So there is always question about link between autonomous vessels and also human role. So although, of course, MAS can reduce the risk of human factors, at the same time, the technical problems of intelligence sensors and operating systems may bring more unknown risk to the ship. And in this case, intervention of seafarers, supervision of seafarers or remote operator are particularly important. So it's definitely time to learn new skills. So STCW convention should regulate and guide the training and management of seafarers so that they can adopt the development of MAS and master the required knowledge and skills. So that's the reason why this convention is so important, although our, of course, opinion is that conventions in general and regulations in general should not be the main factors hindering the development of MAS. Convention, STCW convention was adopted 40 years ago and it was amended a few times. There are several small amendments as well as a couple of big ones. And this convention contains of 8 chapters. You can see here it's chapters with the different topics. And also part of this convention is STCW code. So this code was adopted 30 years ago, and it was also amended a few times. And as I said, it is part of STCW convention. STCW code contains 2 parts. Part A, which is mandatory and contains the minimum regulation that must be met in order to ensure compliance with the provisions of STCW convention, and Part B, which is recommendation and contains guidelines that serve as an aid in the application of provision of this convention. As you can see, STCW is divided into 8 different chapters. So we can find so many different provisions. For example, in chapter 1, there are some general conditions, and in chapter 2, the standards for deck service. And also we can find in next chapter standards for machine service, radio operators. In chapter 5, there are standards related to different types of ships. And we can find also standards for training programs and the procedure in emergency situation, further standards of safety, security, protection, first aid, as well as medical care and survival at sea. Then chapter 7 prescribes standards for recognition and replacement of certificates. And finally, chapter 8 is prescribed the standards for watch keeping. So many different provisions in current STCW convention. The last significant or important major changes or amendments were in 2010, so I'm talking about Manila amendments. It was also interesting to find that in 2010, it was also recommended that STCW convention should be comprehensively revised every 10 years to ensure that they are up to date with existing technologies. So definitely it is time to do some major change as they planned. Also, as I said, this convention has so many minimal requirements for certification, education, training, watchkeeping for seafarers that must be met by the member states. So these minimal standards are actually duties that are globally applicable and also compliant by the member states. So according to STCW, current STCW convention, the minimum standards related to education of seafarers are divided in services. So we have deck service, machine service, and radio service. So seafarers' activities include and duties and responsibilities and tasks that are provided, safe operation of the ship, human lives, of course, and protection of marine environment. So these duties, responsibilities, and tasks are prescribed for each activity with necessary competencies. So according to STCW convention, seafarers' activities can be carried out on different levels of responsibility. The highest one is, of course, management level of responsibility, which refers to this title of master, first officer of the deck, the engine manager, the second engine officer. Then we have operational levels of responsibility, which refers to the title of officer responsible for navigation watch. Then officer responsible for watch in engine room, electrical engineering officer, radio operator on board, and last one is this lowest level of responsibility, which refers also to different jobs on board, such as, for example, ship electrician, ship's crew member that forms part of navigation watch or watch in engine room, or senior crew member who is part of navigation watch, or senior crew member who is part of the watch in engine room. So these levels of responsibility are marked in the certificates. So seafarers' duties and levels of responsibilities are listed in certificates. That's the reason why these certificates, according to STCW convention, are so important. Plus, certificates of competencies are acquired for performing these maritime activities. So we have navigation, of course, cargo handling and stowage, controlling the operation of the ship, then also care for person on board, and then there is marine engineering, electrical, electronic, and control engineering, maintenance and repairs, and radio communication. So therefore, when it comes to in these parts of STCW convention, its provisions should be analyzed. So we already hear this morning about discussion about discussion on mass. So just briefly, everything started actually when they agreed to include mass in its strategic plan. Few sessions after that they started to develop regulatory scoping exercises. You know, so this scoping exercise was seen as a starting point that touched an extensive range of issues, including also human elements, which is from this point of STCW convention is important. And they also approved the framework for regulatory scoping exercise, so they find definitions, methodology, and so on. On the next session, they also developed and approved guidelines for mass trail. And next step was when they finished regulatory scoping exercise for safety treaties and for treaties under legal committee. Few next sessions are so important because on this one they made further progress on development of non-mandatory goal-based instrument regulating the operation of mass. But this session was also important because Maritime Safety Committee included the human element training and watchkeeping subcommittee to conduct a comprehensive review of this convention to adopt the existing global standards for seafarers training to reflect new trends and developments and changes in maritime sector. Also, Maritime Safety Committee approved a new work output called Comprehensive Review and Revision of STCW Convention and plus, of course, code as a part of this convention. And this is a huge job, huge task. So noting that this is not an easy job, Maritime Safety Committee instructed the Human Element Training and Watchkeeping Subcommittee to make a preliminary assessment and prepare a road map on how this proposal should be moved forward. So now this subcommittee is focused on 22 key areas. So 22 different key areas are under consideration. Among other areas, for example, there are also digitalization in seafarer certification, including e-certification, emerging technologies on ships and ship operations, then emerging technologies in education and training, and so on and so on. As I said, 22 areas such as mental health as well, then cyber security as well. Next session, just a few highlights from that one. They adopted two amendments about to STCW Convention and Code. It was in subject of certification, and they also develop another highlight from this session is also mass code development. So Maritime Safety Committee on this one noted that common position of the group on training, certification, and competency requirements, stating that STCW Convention applies to seafarers on mass, but not remote operators and masters at remote operations center. So IMO has also acknowledged that the new mass code will need to address all training, certification, and competency requirements. Also, it is necessary to point out some decisions from joint working group of mass. So we have and safety and legal and facilitation committee in one working group. So they agreed on so many decisions. For example, there should be human master responsible for a mass regardless of mode of operation or degrees or level of autonomy. Also, the master may not need to be on board depending on the technology used on mass and human presence on board. Also, master of mass should have the means to intervene when it's necessary, and master master may be responsible for multiple masts at the same time under certain conditions. And also they agreed that it was too early to discuss the roles of the crew and of mass, because the definition of the role of the master may affect their roles and responsibilities. On this session, they'll also find definition of remote operations center, and they said that is a location remote from a mast that can be operated same or all aspects of functions on mast. They also agreed that the possibility of one or more of operation center being responsible for mast on a single voyage under certain conditions, and only a single operation center must be responsible for mast at any time, and the master of operation center may be responsible for multiple masts at the same time under certain conditions. And finally, at the end, they also agreed that requirements for operation center should be further discussed when Maritime Safety Committee, when they develop maritime mast code. Last session was in May, so they, among other amendments which they adopted in IMO's IMO Maritime Safety Committee, they also decided that the new code for autonomous ship was progressed. So at this session, IMO has agreed to develop non-mandatory base code, MAS code, potentially entering into force as a mandatory code upon experience with its application. So non-mandatory code, as you already know, it's planned to be finished next year, maybe in May, followed by experience building phase after its adoption, and mandatory MAS code is expected to enter into force in 2032. So Maritime Safety Committee also agreed that MAS code should apply to cargo ship, excluding high-speed cargo craft, and also they agreed on some other details, that structure of the draft code, they agreed on structural draft code that apply if the ship has automated or remote control of the relevant functionality, and that the master should remain on board if there are other persons on board, as well as on methodology and roadmap for comprehensive review of STCW convention. We already hear how this structure of MAS code will look like. So in part one, they are covering overarching matters to be considered in the application of code. In part two, we will find technical principles applicable in all cases when applying the code. And finally, part three, we will find some goals, functional requirements, provisions to be expected in this goal-based instrument, but we still have some subjects under discussion, such as survey and certification chapter, personal training and certification, and other aspects of human element, what is important from our point of view from STCW convention. So when it comes to education of seafarers, of course, the introduction to this new type of the vessels, especially this fourth level of autonomy, I mean, fully autonomous, presents a huge challenge to all institutions engaged in the education of seafarers. But we know, of course, the definition of MAS, and we know from regulatory scoping exercise how we have different levels of autonomy, but the question is here, what kind of role human will have on each level or each degree of autonomy. So, of course, at the first level, we have ship with the automated processes and decision supporting. But in this case, seafarers are on board to operate and to control. So their role will be supervision and operation. On second level, of course, we have a remotely controlled ship with seafarers on board. So in this case, the ship is controlled and operated operated from another location. So we can explain human role as backup to maneuver and supervision the systems. At these last two levels, we don't have seafarers on board, but at this level, there is still human role. We have remotely controlled ship without seafarers, as I said, but the ship is controlled and operated from another location. So human role is monitoring and remote control. And at this fully autonomous ship level, we have the operation system of the ship, which is able to make decisions and take actions by itself. Okay, human role in this case is monitoring and emergency management. So different roles and different situation for each level. So this introduction to this new type of vessel bring definitely a lot of changes in roles and systems of seafarers, but not just in that part, also in roles and systems of ports, search and rescue activities, ports, as well as you could already as you already heard. So it means that mascot should be established in a productive and flexible way. So here is also one interesting table. So as I said, IMO has agreed to reference STCW Convention to autonomous shipping, but there is also a list of other international conventions such as SOLAS and search and rescue and tonnage. So for each of the degrees of autonomy, there is so first, second, third, and fourth, it is indicated in which direction the instrument should be adjusted and the most appropriate way to addressing mass operating. So you can see here on the your right side, the interpretation of the numbers in the table. So next to the name of conventions, there are numbers for different degrees of autonomy. So talking about STCW convention, in the case of this convention, it can be seen that amending the existing instruments or developing new instruments are applied from the level to mass level 2. Also, according to Maritime Safety Committee, when there are seafarers on mass, STCW convention applies to them, but when remote operators and masters at the remote operation centers are not on board the ship, STCW convention does not apply to those persons. So just few more conclusions and highlights. STCW convention is applied to first degree and to second degree of mass. So when the ship autonomy is at the first and second degree, the framework and rules of current STCW convention can still be applied. So there is no seafarers on this third and the fourth degree of mass. But what we know by now that the requirements for the knowledge and skills of the ship remote operators will be higher than the second degree of mass. So the existing STCW convention does not cover unmanned ship because it's different than the mass, and the mandatory and recommended competencies in its area addressed to the people on board. And just at the end, I would like to mention that some maritime educational institution, they have already include some concept of autonomous ships in their study programs, in their curricula, such as, for example, in one faculty of maritime studies in our country, but we can find some examples and around the world. For example, at university in Tasmania, there is one college, Australian Maritime College. They already have new training courses called Marine Autonomous Surface Ships for Masters, and they have few interesting courses such as computer networking, data communication and transfer, data analysis management, theory and science of autonomous maritime systems. So these are excellent examples for education, maritime educational institution in which direction study programs should be planned. Thank you for your attention.